You shook the box before you opened it. This is not something anyone told you to do. It is something you did instinctively, the way children understand the grammar of gifts before anyone teaches it to them. The shake that told you whether the parts were loose inside or still held in the tray, that let the sound of the box inform you about the density and variety of what was coming. The Monogram box had a specific sound when you shook it, a dry plastic rattle, different from the rattle of marbles or the rattle of coins. A sound that suggested organized complexity, parts waiting to become something. The box art arrived first, before the model, before the parts, before any of the actual building. There was the illustration on the lid, the P-51D Mustang in a screaming dive, gun ports firing, with the landscape of occupied France visible below and other aircraft visible at the edges of the frame, or the Corvette Stingray in a color that was simultaneously and accurately called candy apple red, photographed or illustrated at an angle that made it look like it was already moving, or the Saturn V rocket standing on the pad at Cape Kennedy, with all the drama of a civilization betting itself on the possibility of reaching another world. Monogram's box art was not product photography. It was narrative painting, and the narrative it was selling was not the model you were about to build. It was the thing. The model represented the moment, the speed, the ambition, the history, translated into a 13-inch cardboard lid designed to arrest the attention of a child standing in the aisle of a hobby shop, drugstore, department store, or five and dime. Then you open the box. The smell of styrene plastic, fresh molded polystyrene, which has a specific, clean, slightly sweet chemical note that is not unpleasant and is not natural and is entirely specific to this experience, rose from the parts trays. The sprues were gray, or sometimes flat olive, or occasionally white, and each part was connected to the tree of the sprue by small connection points called gates. And the relationship between the part and the sprue was the first thing you had to understand, that the parts existed in potential within the sprue, and that releasing them correctly with the right tool at the right angle, leaving just enough of the gate to sand cleanly, was the beginning of build. The instruction sheet unfolded to reveal diagrams of the build sequence. Step 1, attach part A to part B. Step 2, combine with part C. Exploded views that showed the relationships between components in three-dimensional space, drawn with an axonometric projection that was itself a small lesson in visual thinking. If you remember the specific weight of a Monogram box in your hands, the box art that made promises the model inside was ambitious enough to try to take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Not for the algorithm, but so stories like this don't disappear in the way that physical things disappear. Gradually, then without trace, leaving only the memory of the smell of styrene plastic and the sound of the shake. Jack Besser and Bob Rader had both worked at Comet Models, and the thing they understood when they left to found Monogram in Chicago in 1945 was that the model building hobby was about to become something very different from what it had been before the war. The war had done two things to the model aviation world simultaneously. It had made aircraft, specifically American military aircraft, into cultural icons of the first order, and it had trained an enormous number of American men in the specific literacy of three-dimensional mechanical systems. The men who came back from the Pacific and from Europe had spent years in proximity to aircraft, to ships, to tanks and vehicles and engines of every kind. They understood in the felt, embodied way of people who have worked on real machines, what machines were made of and how they worked. These men would buy model kits and, more importantly, They would buy model kits for their children, and they would build them alongside those children. And the building would be different from the casual play of a child, building a toy because the man at the table had a reference in his hands, an actual understanding of what the 148 scale P-51 was trying to represent, of what the 4 caliber machine guns in each wing actually looked like, and how they were fed ammunition, of what the cockpit of a Mustang actually contained, and where the pilot sat in relation to the engine and the tail. Monogram's first products in 1945 were balsa wood kits of ships and airplanes. The USS Missouri, the USS Shangri-La, the hobby destroyer, produced to serve this market. This specific cohort of men and their children at this specific post-war moment. And by 1954, they introduced their first all-plastic kit, a bright red 1/20th scale midget racer, followed almost immediately by a 1/1 scale hot rod. The plastic revolution in model kits was a genuinely significant moment in American consumer culture. The emergence of injection-molded polystyrene as a toy material that could hold detail at small scale more faithfully than balsa, that was lighter, that required less preparation before painting, that came preformed into shapes that balsa required cutting and sanding to achieve. Revell had gotten there first, with a model of the 1910 Maxwell automobile marketed to hardware stores. But Monogram followed immediately, and what followed was a competition between 2 Chicago-based companies that would last 3 decades and would, between them, define what plastic model kits were in American culture. By 1956, Boy's Life, the publication that reached every American Boy Scout, which meant it reached a demographic cross-section of American boys that no other single publication could match, reported that 80% of American boys would become builders of scale models. 80%. That number, whatever its methodological basis, tells you something about the cultural moment. Model building was not a niche hobby in 1956. It was an expected component of American boyhood, as universal as baseball cards or bicycles, and the companies that served it were not serving a specialty market. They were serving the center of American youth culture. Monogram understood this and built its catalog accordingly. The aircraft kits came first, and they came in the familiar shapes of the war: the Spitfire, the P-38 Lightning, the F-86 Sabre, the F-105 Thunderchief with its spring-loaded ejection seat that could be triggered by a tiny plastic tab on the side of the fuselage. A gimmick, yes, but a gimmick that understood exactly what a 10-year-old boy wanted from a model airplane. They also built cars. The 1932 Ford Deuce 5-window coupe in 1959. The custom show cars with Tom Daniel, designs that transformed the car kit into something between a model and a fantasy. And eventually, the Big T in 1962, a 1/8 scale 1924 Ford model. T bucket rod so large that the completed model was over 2 feet long and came with an optional electric motor that could drive the wheel. The car kits and the aircraft kits served different populations with different relationships to the subject matter, and Monogram's ability to serve both populations simultaneously was one of the things that distinguished it from competitors who had made a sharper bet on one category or the other. And MPC had bet on cars, specifically on the manufacturer promotional model business, where Detroit's automakers paid for the molds and the royalties so their latest models could appear in plastic at hobby shop counters. In the same season, they appeared in showrooms. This gave AMT and MPC extraordinary access to tooling that Monogram had to pay for itself, but it also made their catalogs narrower and their survival more dependent on the continued enthusiasm of the automotive market for promotional model programs. When that market shifted, AMT and MPC shifted with it, sometimes in directions that reduced the quality and accuracy that serious builders expected. Monogram's broader catalog meant that the company served not just the boy who was obsessed with cars or the boy who was obsessed with airplanes, but the boy who was obsessed with the general category of things that moved fast and were built with engineering precision, a category that included the muscle car and the Warbird and the Saturn V, and eventually the space shuttle, all of which appear in the Monogram catalog in a form that a child could assemble at the kitchen table. The breadth was both a commercial strategy and a statement about the hobby. That scale modeling was not a specialist's pursuit, but a broad cultural practice that contained multitudes. That the same sensibility that led a child to want to build a 1/105th scale 69 Camaro could lead them, a year later, to want to build a 148 scale Messerschmitt Bf 109, and that the skills developed in building one were directly transferable to building the other. The decade that followed, the Big T, was the decade that built Monogram's reputation as a serious model company among serious model builders. Shepard Paine joined the company in the early 1970s and changed what a Monogram kit box could be. Paine was not a marketing person. He was a model builder of unusual skill, a diorama artist who understood that the way to sell a model kit was to show what the model could become in the hands of someone who treated it, not as a toy to be assembled, but as a starting point for a realistic miniature representation of a real historical moment. The Paine dioramas that appeared on Monogram box lids and in instruction booklets through the 1970s were remarkable objects. A Stuka dive bomber in a realistic nosedive position, with the landing gear extended in the characteristic fixed undercarriage of the type and the ground visible below in painted plastic. A tiger tank in a realistic setting with painted figures and terrain. These were not photographs of models. They were photographs of representations of historical moments, and they were indistinguishable to the casual eye from photographs of the actual events they depicted. They demonstrated to the person who stood in the hobby shop aisle what was possible, not what you would accomplish on your first build or your fifth, but what the hobby could give you if you were willing to develop the skills it required. And this was Monogram's genius at its most subtle. The box did not promise that you would produce what was on the lid. It promised that what was on the lid was possible, and that what was inside the box was the starting point. And the gap between the starting point and the destination was occupied by skill, and skill was developed through practice, and practice required buying and building more kits. This was excellent business strategy that was also genuinely true. A person who built 100 Monogram kits was a considerably better painter and assembler and finisher than a person who had built 2. And the Monogram catalog was broad enough to sustain that journey, from the beginner aircraft that snapped together with minimal painting required to the 1/8 scale engineering showpieces that required weeks of work and genuine craft. The catalog, at its peak, covered every category of American transportation and military aspiration. The aircraft, the B-17 Flying Fortress in multiple versions, the F-4 Phantom, the SR-71 Blackbird in the dramatic black that made the model unmistakable on any shelf. The cars, the muscle car era immortalized in plastic, the Chevelle SS and the Charger and the Mustang Fastback in the colors and configurations that the automotive culture of the late 1960s and early 1970s had made into icons. The space program, the lunar module, the Apollo capsule, the entire sequence of the American space effort available to a child in 1/96th scale at a price that made the ambition of the American space program tactile. and personal. The military, the tanks and half-tracks and figures and terrain accessories that allowed a serious diorama builder to construct a miniature version of a historical engagement accurate enough in its details to function as a kind of informal historical research. Building a monogram kit was a specific experience that required time and demanded attention in ways that most childhood activities did not. The first step was always the same: reviewing the instruction sheet, which was not a suggestion but a document with consequences. The kit's design assumed that the parts were assembled in the specified sequence, and parts assembled out of sequence could not be painted separately before assembly, which was the correct approach. Because painting a part inside a fuselage after the fuselage was closed required the supernatural flexibility of someone who could reach through solid plastic. You read the instructions before you started. This was a discipline. Clipping parts from the sprue was the first tactile pleasure. The sprue cutters, or the hobby knife, positioned at the gate and cutting with a controlled pressure that separated the part cleanly, leaving just a small nub that would be sanded flush. This was a physical skill that improved with practice. The beginner left rough gate marks that showed through the paint. The experienced modeler left a surface indistinguishable from the surrounding molded plastic. The difference between those two outcomes was practice, and practice was 100 small decisions about where to hold the cutter, and how much pressure to apply, and where the gate nub sat relative to the surface that mattered. Seam lines were the other discipline. Injection molded plastic parts were made in two-part molds, and the seam, where the two halves of the mold met, left a thin raised line of plastic running across the part, invisible on a finished model if you addressed it, conspicuous on a finished model if you didn't. Addressing it meant sanding with progressively finer grits of sandpaper, from coarse enough to remove the raised line to fine enough that the surface was smooth under your fingertip, then priming to reveal any remaining imperfections, then sanding again, then priming again. This was not a fast process. It was the process that separated the model that looked like a toy from the model that looked like a reduced version of the real thing. The cockpit was where serious aircraft builders invested their greatest attention. The cockpit interior of a scale aircraft was visible through the canopy, which meant that the level of detail painted inside the cockpit directly determined how realistic the finished model appeared. Monogram provided cockpit details in the kit, the instrument panel, the seat, the rudder pedals, and they provided, in the instruction sheet, the colors that each component should be painted. The experienced builder painted each cockpit component separately before the fuselage was assembled and installed them into the fuselage in the final moments before the two halves were joined. The intermediate builder assembled the fuselage first and then worked the brush into the cockpit through the open canopy area, which was harder and less effective. The beginner assembled everything and then wondered why the cockpit looked painted rather than realistic. Decals were the final test. The sheet of markings that Monogram included in every kit contained the national insignia, the aircraft number, the stenciled maintenance instructions, the squadron markings, the kill markings, every piece of identification that the original aircraft had carried. The decal was applied by cutting it from the sheet, floating it in warm water for 30 to 60 seconds until the adhesive softened, and then sliding the decal from its backing paper onto the model's pre-gloss coated surface, positioning it and removing the excess water with a soft cloth. The decal that was applied correctly conformed to the surface, including its curved surfaces, and disappeared into the finish as if it had been painted on. The decal that was applied incorrectly lifted at the edges, silvered under the clear coat, refused to conform to curved surfaces, and announced its own presence rather than the information it was supposed to convey. You waited for the glue to dry. This is the element of model building that is easiest to rush and most consequential when rushed. The tube cement that Monogram's instructions specified, testers or similar, required a minimum cure time before the joint could be handled or stressed, and the exact minimum was not specified on the tube. You learned the cure time empirically by handling joints too early and seeing the white stress marks that told you the solvent had not fully finished its work. You learned to wait. This was patience as a mechanical requirement, not as a virtue in the abstract. The weathering was the final conversation between the builder and the subject. A military aircraft that had spent months in operational service was not factory fresh. It showed the accumulation of exhaust staining along the fuselage, behind the engine exhausts, the chipping of paint at the leading edges where the slipstream abraded the surface, the oil streaking below the access panels, where maintenance had not been entirely neat. To represent these effects on a scale model required controlled application of techniques that modelers called weathering. Thin washes of dark paint allowed to flow into panel lines and recesses, and then partially wiped from the raised surfaces, leaving the shadows where shadows existed on the real aircraft. Dry brushing of lighter colors along the edges and raised details to represent the wear that metal showed under handling. Careful streaking of rust-toned or oil-toned paint below the points where the real aircraft's fluids would have left their mark. A well-weathered Monogram aircraft kit could be mistaken in a photograph for a museum-quality scale model produced by a professional. This was not an exaggeration. Shepard Paine's work had demonstrated that the gap between the Monogram kit and the professional scale model was not primarily a materials gap, and it was a skill and time gap, and both of those things were available to any builder willing to develop the skill and invest the time. The finished model, after the hours of seam sanding and cockpit painting and decal floating and clear coating, the finished model sat on its display stand in the specific arrested completeness of a made thing. The Mustang was no longer parts in a box. It was an object in the world, occupying three-dimensional space, representing with varying degrees of accuracy a specific aircraft that had flown over Europe 50 years before. Whatever the accuracy, whatever the quality of the finish, it was yours in a specific way that purchased things are not yours. It contained the hours. It contained the learning. It contained the specific decisions about cockpit color and decal placement that you had made, with reference to photographs and your own judgment and the authority of the Monogram instruction sheet. The hobby shop was the physical space where all of this began and where it returned, continuously for the purchase of paint and supplies and new kits, and the advice that only a counter person who had been building for 20 years could provide. The hobby shop of the 1960s and 1970s was not a retail environment in the contemporary sense, not a space organized around purchase, efficiency, and impulse buying. And it was a specific kind of community space, organized around a specific kind of practice, staffed by people who were practitioners first and retailers second. You could walk into the right hobby shop and describe the problem you were having: the canopy fogged by the solvent in the decal solution, the seam that wouldn't sand flush because the plastic was softer than expected, and receive a specific answer from someone who had encountered the exact same problem on the exact same kit, because they had built every kit in the store before recommending it to anyone, which was the only honest basis for recommendation. This kind of expertise was not scalable. It did not survive the transition to online retail, where the counter person was a search engine and the specific expertise of a practitioner was replaced by customer reviews that reflected the whole range from careful to careless. The hobby shop's physical organization was its own argument for the hobby's seriousness. Kits, stacked in rows from the floor to the ceiling on metal shelving units, organized by manufacturer and by category: aircraft, cars, ships, military, science fiction, with the monogram section occupying a significant portion of any shop that carried plastic kits. Because Monogram's catalog was that broad and because Monogram's reputation for quality attracted serious buyers who returned for more. The smell of a hobby shop, the ambient combination of styrene, enamel paint, mineral spirits, and whatever was currently being demonstrated at the back of the shop, was distinct and total, a sensory environment that belonged to no other kind of retail. The paint section of a well-stocked hobby shop was itself a significant education. The tester's enamel bottles, arranged in rows by color number, each one a small glass container with a brushed aluminum cap that you had to turn exactly 4 times to open, contained colors whose names were as specific as their uses: flat gold gray field blue, interior green, dark earth, sand yellow, gloss black. These were not decorative color names. They were historical color specifications, the colors that aircraft manufacturers and military organizations had specified for aircraft and vehicles and equipment, translated into small glass bottles for the person who wanted their model to be accurate rather than merely attractive. And knowing which colors to apply to which model, the RAF camouflage scheme of the Battle of Britain, the Pacific Theater Japanese Navy colors, the olive drab of American Army Air Forces, required research, and the research was part of the hobby. The airbrush was the tool that separated the intermediate modeler from the serious one. The Posh, or the Badger, or the Iwata, connected to a small compressor that provided the regulated air pressure the airbrush required, allowed the modeler to apply paint in ways that a brush could not match: smooth gradients, thin, even coats that did not obscure surface detail. The specific misting technique that produced the scale effect of worn or faded paint on a subject that was supposed to appear weathered. The airbrush required cleaning after every use, which meant understanding the chemistry of paint well enough to know which solvent was appropriate for each type of paint: enamel, acrylic, lacquer, and having that solvent on hand and using it correctly. The airbrush user in the hobby shop was recognizable by the specific combination of chemical knowledge and manual precision that the tool required. Mattel acquired Monogram in 1968, and the corporate ownership changes that followed through a series of acquisitions and restructurings that eventually brought the company under Hallmark Cards' Binney and Smith subsidiary, and then into the 1986 merger with Revell that created Revell Monogram. Tell a story about what happens to craft companies when they are absorbed into larger entities whose primary competencies are not in craft. The Revell Monogram merger was, in a narrow commercial sense, logical. 2 companies competing in the same market, with largely compatible product catalogs, with overlapping distribution channels, with the combined scale to negotiate better terms with their suppliers. From the perspective of the hobby that the merger served, the combination was less obviously an improvement. 2 distinct personalities, 2 sets of designers and engineers and box artists, 2 cultures of quality and aesthetic judgment became one, and the one was necessarily different from both. The Monogram name appeared under the Revell name on the boxes after 1987, and when Hobbico acquired Revell Monogram in 2007 for $100 million and renamed it the Revell Group, the Monogram name disappeared entirely from the packaging. What had been at its peak one of the two defining names in American plastic modeling. The company that had commissioned Shepard Paine's dioramas and Tom Daniels' custom car designs, that had produced the Big T and the Saturn V and the 1/8 scale Corvette that measured over 23 inches assembled, was gone in the sense that its name was no longer on the boxes. The molds continued. The kits continued. The name was retired. The forces that had been gathering for years finally converged in the 1990s and 2000s in ways that changed the hobby more fundamentally than any corporate merger had changed it. The video game did not destroy plastic modeling. It displaced a significant portion of the time budget that the previous generation of boys and men had spent at the building table. And it did so at exactly the developmental moment, the years between 10 and 16, when hobbies were established, when the building identity was either formed or not formed, that determined whether the next generation would buy monogram kits. This was not a conspiracy or a moral failure. It was the operation of competition for human attention, in which the immediately rewarding activity, the video game that provided feedback at digital speed, without the waiting that drying glue required, without the failure that a bad seam repair produced, attracted the younger generation's leisure time at a structural advantage that model building could not overcome. In the model kit required patience. The video game provided immediate satisfaction. These were not equivalent offers, and the one that required patience lost ground to the one that provided satisfaction at the rate that the technology made satisfaction available. The independent hobby shops contracted. The big box craft retailers that replaced them, Hobby Lobby, Michaels, carried model kits, but did not carry the expertise that the independent shop counterperson had housed. The internet carried the expertise in a dispersed, searchable form. But the dispersal removed the relationship that the hobby shop counterperson had provided, the mentorship, the recommendation, the specific knowledge of what a 10-year-old builder who had just finished their first kit could reasonably take on next. Hobbico's bankruptcy in 2018, the same bankruptcy that dissolved Tower Hobbies and displaced thousands of jobs in Champaign, Illinois, included the Revell Group and its holdings, the legal descendant of Monogram. The assets were sold. The German Revell GmbH acquired the North American Revell name and assets, and the kit line continues under German ownership and management. Monogram's molds in many cases survive within that line. The 148 Mustang is still available. The B17 is still available. The models exist. What has changed is not the availability of the objects, but the availability of the culture that animated them. The hobby shops, the expert counter people, the Saturday afternoon ritual of the kitchen table, and the building board and the instruction sheets spread out next to the parts tray, and the father who had flown Mustangs or seen them fly, and who could tell you, as you painted the cockpit, what the instrument panel actually looked like from the pilot's seat. The question that the Monogram story poses is about what we built when we thought we were building models. A child who built 100 model kits over a decade of childhood had developed specific capabilities that transferred to every other manual and intellectual task they encountered. The ability to read technical diagrams, to organize a complex task into manageable steps, to work at a fine motor skill level that hands not trained in precise work cannot easily achieve, to apply patience as a practical tool rather than as an abstract virtue, to accept the imperfect result and understand what had gone wrong and approach the next iteration differently. These capabilities were not guaranteed by building model kits. They were available to the person who built model kits seriously, who engaged with the difficulty rather than circumventing it, who rebuilt the cockpit when the first attempt was inadequate rather than accepting the inadequacy. What is lost when the building table empties is not the product of the building, the models themselves, which can be purchased, assembled, or replaced by digital representations. What is lost is the process and the specific things the process built in the person who underwent it. The patience is not cultivated by an activity that provides immediate feedback. The fine motor skill is not developed by touchscreens whose forgiving surfaces accept imprecision. The ability to read a technical diagram and implement it in three-dimensional space is not trained by consuming media that has been designed for passive engagement. These are not arguments that plastic modeling is superior to digital entertainment or that the past was better than the present. They are observations about what specific activities produce in the people who practice them, and about the specific gap that opens in a culture's practical capability when those activities disappear. The model builder of the 1960s and 1970s was developing a specific kind of spatial intelligence, the ability to see a three-dimensional object in a two-dimensional diagram, to understand how the parts related to each other in space before they were assembled, to anticipate the consequences of assembly decisions before they were made. This spatial intelligence is not unique to model building, but model building delivered it to an enormous population of children in a context that also delivered fine motor skills, patience, and historical literacy about the subjects the kits represented. The combination of these capabilities, developed through the same activity, is what made serious model builders distinctively capable in ways that spilled beyond the hobby shop into their professional and practical lives. If you built models, if you have a memory of a monogram kit that you built and what it felt like to finish it, share that memory in the comments below. Not as nostalgia for a simpler time, but as evidence. The evidence that these activities produce something real in the people who practice them seriously is not preserved in corporate archives or market research reports. And it exists in the memory of the people who built the models. And the only way it reaches the people who need to hear it is if those people choose to say so. The model is on the shelf. It has been there for years, perhaps for decades, in the specific stillness of completed things that have fulfilled their purpose and have no further ambition. The decals have not silvered. The paint has not yellowed. The seam lines are visible if you look closely, which tells you about the skill level of the builder at the time of construction. And the skill level tells you about the age of the builder. And the age tells you when this was built. And when this was built tells you when the culture that produced it was alive. The AP51D Mustang in 1/48 scale. The canopy catches the light on its convex surface. The landing gear is extended. The flaps down in the landing configuration that Monogram's design specified for the display stand. The roundels and the code letters on the fuselage are the specific markings of a specific aircraft from a specific squadron, applied from the decal sheet with the care of someone who understood that accuracy was the point. Monogram made this possible, not the model. You made the model. In Monogram, made the possibility of making the model, which is a different and more important contribution. They designed the molds and printed the box art and wrote the instruction sheets and established the standard of accuracy that made the effort of building worth the effort of building. They did this for decades, and in doing so, they made available to an enormous number of American children and adults the specific pleasure of constructing at a scale you could hold in your hands, a representation of something that was large and fast and significant. The model is on the shelf. The hobby shop where it was bought is gone. The kitchen table where it was built has been in several other houses since then. The person who built it is older now, and the building took place in a year whose specific number is receding. But the model is on the shelf, and it holds everything that went into it. The hours, the learning, the patience, the specific afternoon light in the room where the building happened, in the same way that a well-made thing holds the work that produced it, quietly, without statement for anyone willing to look closely enough to see it.